entrepreneurs, business owners, professionals who seek excellence, bringing the business classroom to you. It's the Business Builders Show. Here's Marty Wolf.
We still got a long way to go. Yes, we all got a long way to go.
Welcome to the Business Builders Show with Marty Wolf, and today with our guest host, J. Kelly Hoey. Along with Kelly and our executive producer, DC Taylor, we will be your guides on this learning journey. To learn more about Kelly, check out her website at jkellyhoey.co. That's jkellyhoey.co. Okay, Kelly, let's get the conversation going.
Thanks, Marty. I am really thrilled today to have Peter, I'm going to botch your last name.
Cullinane.
There, you know what? I'm just decided it's early and I'm going to botch the name. But anyway, Peter is the founder and chief executive of Lewis Road Creamery, one of New Zealand's fastest growing food businesses and the country's premium dairy brand producer. Peter has had a rather interesting career journey to becoming a dairy producer. His previous business experience includes Worldwide COO at global advertising agency Saatchi and Saatchi. Peter, welcome to the Business Builder Show.
Good morning, and thank you, Kelly.
So, from, I want to say, madman, the ad guy, to the milkman, I got to know, how did a college dropout end up with 2 master's degrees and running global agencies?
I think the first part of the career is pretty straightforward in that most of my career has been in advertising, and I finished boarding school and did the usual thing of then starting a commerce degree, and I just couldn't sort of get my head into it really, and it was sort of at a time back then of vast sort of changes going on, and I stumbled actually into advertising, and I know that a big part of your thesis is networking, and New Zealand's such a small place, everyone knows someone, and so I happened to through sort of a family connection get an introduction to a local advertising agency, and I was hired as a sort of a trainee, if you like. And I found that absolutely sort of mesmerizing, and I loved it from the first minute. And so the sort of the world of advertising and how good advertising people think and who they interact with and everything else, I just found very exciting, and it just sort of clicked with me, and I was just very lucky that from there on I went from this local agency as a sort of a junior trainee, and then I stumbled into, these things are sort of serendipity is that sort of wonderful thing of, being in the right place at the right time and being aware of where you are. And I was approached to join Ogilvy and Mather, which in those days was one of the first sort of true international agencies to make it to New Zealand. And so I had a terrific grounding at Ogilvy with the MD there, a guy called Rennie Cunnick, who was an Oxford grad and uber bright and uber clever and incredibly helpful to getting me started. So I did that for maybe a couple of years. As I say, my chronology is terrible, so these dates never add up, so never hold me to dates. But I did that for sort of a couple of years, and then I had one of those things that I thought, I should really do the whole overseas travel thing. And so I set out to do that, and I got as far as Australia. And the usual rule is that you work hard somewhere or other, and then you go off to Europe. So I did the hard work, but I worked in a coal mine in Whyalla, which is in South Australia, a very out in the middle of nowhere. And I did that for exactly a year. And then rather than go on to Europe, I came back to New Zealand because I had met my future wife just before leaving. And so I came back, and I then joined an agency called Mackay King, which was, again, a local agency that was run by, again, someone that I knew. And his son was taking over the agency, and indeed I had been to the same school as his son, a guy called Terry King. And
say those damn networks and who you know, sliding in again there, Peter.
It was really work. And so we then grew that agency, and that agency was grew from a small local agency and became one of the biggest in the country. And then we approached Saatchi and Saatchi to sell. Saatchi's already had an agency in New Zealand, so it was a very curious deal. But we basically sold to Saatchi's, and then were given the task of merging our agency and the existing Saatchi agency together. And I ended up running that combined agency, and we became, the biggest, and I can say, hand on heart, best agency in the country. And I think I was about 31 or 32 when that happened. So I've been sort of involved in that agency world ever since. And then Saatchi carried on, and I ran New Zealand and then Australia and New Zealand, and then went on the Worldwide management board, and then finally moved to New York, where in that typical sort of agency way, I ran everything other than the country I was in, which was the US. But I was based in New York, and had a fabulous time. I loved my time in New York, and I've loved sort of the whole agency world. After September 11, I was stuck in Paris, and my wife, my current wife, and young daughter, who was like a 3-year-old, had just flown back to New York the night before. And that morning, September 11 happened. And so we then had one of those moments where you say, well, hang on, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And we made the decision to come back to New Zealand. And I started, I had a wonderful time. I was on gardening leave for a year. And we spent that, most of that time was spent in a little village in Provence called Tourette-sur-Loup. So we had
honestly, and I'm going to pause you there for those who don't see, because I think going on gardening leave is one of the greatest inventions of all time. And so for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what that is, European companies, British European companies, you leave, your contracts often have, if you're a senior executive, this kind of garden leave, so you don't go and work for a competitor, and you get paid and you can, I guess, go garden.
And that's much what I did. And what I actually did was I did a number of things, including I had a wonderful. So the reason we went to Tourette-sur-Loup was the person that we did the deal with at Saatchi's had a holiday house in Tourette-sur-Loup, and his name was Alban Lloyd. And so we got on famously with Alban and Rosemary, and decided that that's where we would go. And Rosemary, as it turns out, is a fabulous chef and writer. And so she introduced me to a culinary school, which I did in France. So I sort of could do my basic. I like the idea of being able to cook everything I like to eat. I've got a pretty limited menu, so I don't need it's not too complicated. But we had a ball in France. Finished that, came back to New Zealand, and started a company called Assignment Group, which was a group of 4 partners, the key people out of Saatchi New Zealand, and including the chief executive of Saatchi London at the time. And so just the 4 of us. And we went from being, you get sort of pretty spoiled growing up in a big network, and, we had all the resources and everything for 20 odd years. And we came back to New Zealand, and the 4 of us decided that we would start an agency. It would just be the 4 of us, and we would do everything ourselves.
Were you nuts? What were you thinking?
So were we nuts? Probably, but it was the most exciting thing to do, because you've got no one to fall back on but your 3 partners. And we started, we didn't even know how to make a cup of tea or coffee or none of that stuff. So it was a fabulous learning curve. But again, that business had at its heart some major New Zealand clients, including New Zealand Tourism, which was sort of the biggest single account in the country. And we had a ball, but we did it. We really did do it all pretty much single-handedly. So it was a great segue for me into Lewis Road Creamery, really, because it taught me so much. You get so insulated in big networks or in big businesses that you become sort of expert at one small piece, but not really a great generalist.
So I got to ask, why you're having this ball with these three other partners, doing, a career in an industry you stumbled into, but were mesmerized and loved. Why the heck did you say, oh, I'm going to become a dairy producer? Why am I going to create something that is taking on a big established industry and, dealing with fickle consumers and all the things? Like, what the heck were you thinking, Peter?
Great question. And actually, it was a time of, I do believe in hard work, and I think we were working really hard, but then I sort of came back to that college dropout thing. I thought, hang on, this is like a time to really step up. And so I thought I would do two things. I joined my first sort of public board, which just so happened to be it was a casino called Sky City, which is the biggest sort of casino operator in New Zealand and a major player. So I had my sort of first board experience happening, and at the same time I was doing an MBA, which I completed. And then I did another master's degree, and this time it was master's in management. And that was in the study of, and again, I'd love to come back to this at some stage, but that was the study of not leaders, because I think, this whole leadership thing is sort of slightly overcooked. But I was fascinated by those people who are neither leaders nor followers, and I call them independents, but they're the people who they're reliant on a structure to do what they do. So typical examples would be surgeons or pilots or creative directors or barristers or engineers, people who need, or academics, professors, people who need, an institution around them to do what they do, but they are really independent. And I find those people, fascinating. And so I did that. And then the other thing I had was this little niggle of on the Sky City board, which was the first board I joined. It was a very good board, and one of the directors was Sir Dryden Spring, who was the godfather of New Zealand dairy, if you like, and a very senior player. And we would have these conversations. I'd say to him, Sir Dryden, I don't understand why New Zealand is still sending commodity products offshore. Why don't we have branded, consumer goods? Why don't we step our game up and do what companies like Nestle in a country which is not that much bigger than New Zealand, Switzerland, do so well? And I can remember Dryden sort of rolling his eyes and saying, "Oh no, you don't understand. Switzerland's been doing this for 100 years. We could never do what Switzerland does." And that to me was a sort of a challenge that somehow or other I just found too fascinating to put down. And the way these things work, Kelly, I think this is true for everybody, but it's never sort of one linear thing. It often is in retrospect. You can sort of draw a straight line, but in the middle of things, it's actually it's a sort of a mix of things that somehow or other you create a pattern from. Because another piece of the puzzle for me was, I mentioned boarding school. One of the things that sort of kept me alive was bread and butter. And I love, without being silly, I've got a really simple taste, but they include bread and butter. And I found that New Zealand butter was sometimes good and sometimes not good. And I couldn't understand why that was. And it turns out that the reason for that is that the dairy companies in New Zealand treated butter as something of a byproduct really, and the focus was very much on milk powders and so on and so forth. And so I decided at some stage I switched from buying New Zealand butters to buying a Danish butter called Lurpak, which is a good butter. So anyway, that'd been going on for donkey's years, and I came back when I was back in New Zealand and at assignment, and I was sent by my wife to do the supermarketing one Sunday afternoon, and so I was there loading up the trolley, and I reached out for a pack of Lurpak, and I had one of those true sort of moments where I said, "What's wrong with this picture? Why am I, as a New Zealander, as a Kiwi, reaching out for a pack of Danish butter when
yeah, exactly. You've got cows nearby. Why the hell are you getting butter from the other side of the planet?"
So now this is a true story. So I went back so I put that butter back on the shelf, and I went back to our apartment. And my father came from, most people in New Zealand have some sort of farming heritage in them, and I certainly have. But my father grew up on a farm, but he was a commercial airline pilot. And he was a man of very few words. But I do remember him fondly talking about making butter on the farm as a kid. So anyway, I forgot how you did that. So I looked up YouTube, and I got this wonderful woman from the Appalachian Mountains talking to me on YouTube, and she was sitting in a lazy boy chair and talking to camera, and she had, you call it a mason jar. We call it an AG jar, but a mason jar. And so she said, "Honey, this is to on YouTube. Here's how I make butter." And so I thought, right. So I got back in the car and went to the supermarket and bought some cream and came home and followed her instructions and made butter for the first time. And it was it was fascinating. And what I learned was, anyone can make butter because it's not very complicated, but it's really messy and it's very inefficient. But I made it. And so here's the clever bit about networking, Kelly, that this is where I think it really kicks in. So that evening, so that was the Sunday afternoon, that evening we were going out to dinner with a group of sort of friends and associates. And we're sitting around the table and, having one of those sort of Sunday evening conversations of, what's everyone up to and so on. I was talking to a guy who subsequently, I count as a really close friend, but then he was a sort of I knew him, but I didn't know him that well. But he was saying, "So Pete, what are you up to?" And I was sort of running through, it sounds a bit show-offy, but I was saying, well, Rob, I'm running assignment group, and I'm doing another master's degree, and I've just joined a couple of boards, and no. But I could see that even so, and I also had another company called Antipodes Water, which is a high-end bottled water, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting, Pete. So it's interesting." I said, "Oh, and the other thing I'm going to do, Rob, is I'm going to start a butter company." and it literally just came out of the blue. I don't know, it was a voice speaking.
It was like spat out of your mouth before you could put it back.
I hear myself say it. I'm like, oh. So anyway, he said, "Oh, that's interesting, Pete, but it's not. We've got an expression in New Zealand, which I don't think is replicated in the States, but he said, yeah, interesting, Pete, but it's not going to be a boot of the car company, is it?" And a boot of the car company means, a little business that sort of run. Yeah. Okay.
A business you run out of flea markets out of the trunk of your car, and little hack, a little hobby on the side, nice little business, as people like to say. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly right. What was interesting about that is that my brother, who is very successful, had described Antipodes Water as a boot of the car company years before. Which in a kind way, but I took great exception to. And so to have someone else say, "Yeah, but it's not going to be a boot of the car company," I said, no, it's not. And so, but that was the impetus to go from just sort of, fluffing around in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon to actually doing something. And so the next morning, Monday morning, I rang our local supermarket and asked to speak to the manager. And as it turns out, again, serendipity, the local supermarket that we go to, there are two major supermarket chains in New Zealand. One is corporately owned, and the other is a cooperative. And this supermarket is probably the leading store within that cooperative. So, as it turns out, an incredibly influential store. And I rang and asked to speak to the manager, and it would only happen in New Zealand. I got put straight through.
Of course.
So, and it wasn't because they knew me. It was just like, yeah, sure, I'll put you through. So
yeah, it's Monday. He's not busy. Let me put you through. Yeah.
So Jason Wadihira, who was the owner manager, picked up the phone and said hello. And I said, hello, Jason. You don't know me from a bar of soap, but my wife keeps your supermarket afloat. And so that sort of had him giggling. And I said to Jason, that gave me at least 5 minutes time to speak to him. I said, I just have this vision, Jason, that New Zealand should be making the world's best butter. And if I make it, will you sell it? And he said, if you make it, I'll sell it. And that's literally how things really started.
Well, there's a lesson in there to people, like, sometimes just like, you sort of overthinking things, and the idea that, or they dream about someone buying their product, and it's like, pick up the phone, just make the ask.
That is absolutely correct. And I think that one of the great lessons in this for me is, and it's to borrow a line from someone else, actually, a guy who started another business, a guy called Jeff Ross, who started 42 Below, which is a vodka in New Zealand, which is very famous. And one of his great pieces of advice was just start. And I think there's a huge amount of truth in it. You just got to begin. And I think, Kelly, if I had done a fully fledged business plan, I would never have got this business up and running. Just the barriers to entry are so huge that it's almost sort of impossible to come up against, the dairy industry, which is, in New Zealand, it's dominated by one player.
Well, and you touched on it too. It's the domination, but also the domination of doing things in a certain way, i.e., we're going to export a commodity, and to bust that mindset with dairy farmers, let alone a massive competitor. I'm going to let Marty jump in and see if he's got something here. But I also, when you said you were going to give us a quote, Peter, I have to tease you. I was waiting for you to quote Winston Churchill.
Oh, well, you'll get a Winston Churchill quote from me at some stage.
Marty, you're being way too quiet.
There's proof that we both watched the entire flipping book, because that's at the very end, the Winston Churchill. So Peter, we like to show proof that we prepare for the interview, No, it's a fascinating discussion. And I just to further validate, we do get too hung up in the analytical part of it, and rather than just picking up the phone or contacting someone, it's a great networking story too, what you just told. But so here comes Lewis Road Creamery. Wow, how exciting!
Yeah. Well, so Marty and I were talking about before, Peter, chocolate milk. How have you made that a must-have purchase? I must have it, so I just need to know how you made it must-have and how the heck we're going to have it. But anyway.
Exactly. Well, we're working on all of that. We started. I won't spend too long on it, but we started on butter, and then I thought, well, if we and that went well, and we thought, well, what else isn't being done well? And we looked at milk, and again, while New Zealand has sort of the best raw ingredients, we didn't necessarily treat our milk very well, and it was sort of standardized and it's just not great milk. And I thought, right, let's do a brilliant milk. Let's just go right back to basics and do a fabulous milk the way it used to be, in our grandparents' time. And so we started a range of white milks, which again sort of just absolutely shook up the market. And I was having lunch with the owner of a very a sort of successful boutique grocery chain called Farrow's, and so it's a bit like a Whole Foods of New Zealand. And I was, as I say, at lunch with the owners, and we were chatting, and James, one of the owners, said to me, this milk is all very good, but do you know what I'd love? I'd love a really good chocolate milk. And so I said, right, James, you leave that with me. And so that's sort of where this fabulous story started. And so I thought, if we're going to do a chocolate milk, it's going to have to be it's going to have to be better than anything anyone has done. And I had a long working association with a company called Whittaker's, which is a famous chocolate company in New Zealand.
I have some in my fridge. And I can attest to how fabulous Whittaker's is. Anyway, just that aside, back to the chocolate milk story.
Well, and actually Whittaker's, it strikes me that there's a great company in San Francisco called Guitar Chocolate. And it strikes me that they are actually quite similar in terms of sort of products they make. So I rang, not knowing anything about how you make chocolate milk and everything else. And at that stage, our milk was being made by a small independent bottler, who we still work with. And they had no expertise in this area either, other than to say that they couldn't mix anything other than powder into their milk. And the thing about powder is normally that's the cheapest way of getting a product flavored. And I wanted to make the best product the world had ever seen. So I rang Holly Whittaker, who was the next generation of the family coming up in the family, and said to Holly, "Look, Holly, I'm not sure quite how I'm going to do this, but I want to make a chocolate milk, and if I do it, I want to do it with you. But here's the thing: our bottlers can only use powdered product. What can we do about that?" And as it turns out, they in turn had just invested, many millions in a new chocolate making machine that actually makes the chocolate into a powder before turning it into a block. So it's like a talcum powder, if you like. And so it was literally, and Kelly, this is the thing, it would take most food companies, 3 years to develop a product. We did it in probably 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
Literally, so Holly said, well, look, the only thing we can supply you with is this, powdered chocolate. So I said, righto, we'll send someone up. So she sent up, a bag of this powdered chocolate. And then every product we've made, we've created it in our kitchen. And our kitchen is sort of quite central to everything we do. So we got some fresh milk, and we added some powdered chocolate and shook it up, and it was just a fabulous product.
So what I'm hearing from this part of the story is that you did an extensive business plan, a lot of focus groups, and had a lot of control groups for testing, and then you released the product. Is that one? Would I be correct, Peter?
Something like that.
That's wild. That's wild.
Well, one of the things that I had spent, so I'd spent sort of, my chronology is terrible. It must have been sort of 25 or 30 years in agency land. And, we lived under the tyranny of focus groups, client focus groups where consumer panels would give their feedback on things. And my belief with Lewis Road was I just wanted to do things that I wanted to do. And if I believed that they would work, then I was going to back myself. And I think that is by far, it's a sort of a high risk but high return sort of approach, and it relies on having good judgment and then in backing your judgment. And so on this chocolate milk thing, we had no idea it would be as successful as it was, but we launched it. And my biggest concern actually at the time was, we might have a chocolate milk that's going to go to some pig farm somewhere or other. This thing doesn't work. But it just went up.
I was going to say, if it went to some pig farm, I want to be, ordering the roast from that.
And that's
anyway.
it was just extraordinary. It became an absolute phenomenon. And it became the stuff of endless news stories on television and everywhere else, and made the brand was getting some traction as being like, oh, this is interesting, someone is finally doing something interesting in the dairy sector. And then this thing just sort of blew everything apart in terms of awareness and so on. And so that's how chocolate milk started. And then we took probably 2 years before we could meet demand. So the plant, the bottling plant had to be expanded. There were a million different issues to face, including irate retailers, by the way, who hate not being able to sell something that their customers want.
So I keep putting my microphone on mute because I'm just like laughing because I'm thinking, if you had gone the traditional route to releasing product, in terms of the analysis and stuff, this wouldn't have gotten out there. And I'm just thinking, no, you just got it out there, and then you had to deal with these other problems over 2 years as opposed to overanalyzing it. So how do you deal with irate retailers? What a delightful problem to have, but how do you deal with that?
Delightful, but lingering, I must say. They have very long memories, retailers. And they hate hearing the word no. So I think one of the things that I think I've learned in this Lewis Road experience is you take a sort of a big leap and then you backfill. So it's not as though you can't do the hard work and the analysis and everything else, but I'd rather sort of look back at what we've done and say, okay, what can we learn from that as we go forward, rather than the sort of paralysis by analysis thing. And so with retailers, what we did, Kelly, and hand on heart, I reckon this is an important insight. I sort of determined from day one, really, that we would never do anything that we wouldn't tell you we're doing or that you couldn't discover. And so that we've never. One of my things is I've never said no to a press interview. We've never declined to answer a question, and so I've relied on just absolutely telling it as it is, and it's sort of quite disarming, because big brand companies can't do that. They're so sort of understandably sort of concerned about who says what and so on. But if it's just me
and damn shareholders and all that stuff. See now, Marty, now we know if anyone ever says, how the hell did you get the founder of Lewis Road Creamery on the Business Builder Show, we'll say he never says no to a media interview.
Oh, there you go. But I would prefer to say it was excellent networking. I would prefer to say that, and because he's referred to networking a few times. So in our show notes, Kelly, of course, you're going to have all this, the contact information, like the website, which is fantastic. And you can, in addition to our conversation with Peter, you can see all this in the show notes, I'm sure. And the other thing that's going through my head is major universities all over the world are saying, who are we going to come get our MBA if we have to do it this easy? What the hell, right? But
Peter went and got him an MBA. I mean, a completely side note on all of this stuff, Peter. I mean, between a growing global business, right? Changing an industry in New Zealand, growing global business, the boards, the community service, earning 2 degrees. You got any time management? You aren't doing a quarter of what you were doing?
My management tip, I reckon, is you've got to enjoy doing what you're doing. And I love hard. I have no problem with working hard. I found the MBA fascinating. And really rewarding. And then I found that master's research thesis into sort of these independents. They're the most fascinating people for me. Mm-hmm. So I found that really rewarding. I found sort of exposure to boards and how boards think. It's just really enjoying what you're doing, and then not doing stuff that you're not enjoying. And I think that was really The changing point with Saatchi's really was, I was at a point and position where I thought, I don't know if I'm really enjoying this anymore, and maybe it's time for a change. But you do become a salary slave, and it's very difficult for people, I think, midstream or later in their careers to make a big, bold move. But I'd have to say, you just got to do it every so often. You just got to sort of go out there and just take a big leap of faith, and then back yourself to somehow or other, end up on your feet.
And Peter, looking at the book and other things I see, and this is maybe part of your time management and leading or management, whatever you call it, is I saw the quote maybe several times: "Speed is everything." Apparently, you believe that to be true.
I absolutely believe it to be true, and I think if the whole thing if you don't do it tomorrow, if you can do it today, and you 24 hours is a lot of hours, and I think that you can achieve an enormous amount in a short period of time if you really put the pressure on. I think again, sort of agency training is a bit like that, where you go from dealing with a bank to a paint company, to a cosmetic company, to a dairy company. You're constantly leaping from one issue to another with speed, and I think it does teach you to move very quickly and sort of turn thoughts into action as fast as possible. And if you sort of get into that way of operating, you can achieve a lot in a pretty short period of time. And I do love that old quote from that TV series American Hero, I think, and it was called, and it's pressure makes diamonds. And I do believe that subjecting yourself to a lot of pressure is actually a very rewarding thing to do, not a scary thing to do. And then every so often, then you've got to take a break. But
get some garden leave.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, Kelly, we can't leave until we ask the question: why do you love Winston Churchill? And maybe give us a quote or two to start to wrap up.
Well, I think Winston Churchill is probably the single most impressive person I've ever studied or read or known about. Obviously, Winston Churchill played a big role in World War II. My father was a bomber pilot in World War II, so there was sort of a reasonably direct connection, I guess, to that. But reading his books, and the best biography of Winston Churchill is by William Manchester, which is just an absolutely fabulous trilogy. But I just find his ability. He was always adventurous, Winston, and I think that, when I read what he achieved and compare that to what I've achieved, it's so humbling. Mm-hmm. And I just love the fact that, right through to his dotage, he was still writing and commentating and doing fascinating things and leading an absolutely fascinating life. And his observations were brilliant. And the quote that I think, my own personal motto is, where there's a will, there's a way. If you want to do something, you can do it. It's just a matter of, do you really want to do it? But the way that Winston Churchill summed it up was, one quote, it was, "Fear nothing, live life as it comes, dread naught, all will be well." I just think that's such a wonderful attitude to life.
For business, for life, and a whole lot more. Peter, wow. I have, of course, endless more questions to ask. So I'm, might have to say, will you wake up early again in a morning in Auckland to come back on the Business Builder Show? But thank you for the generosity of your time and your insights and sharing your story with us today.
That's an absolute pleasure, Kelly. Thank you very much. And thank you, Marty, and thank you, DC.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you so much for listening to the Business Builders Show. To learn more about me, and I'm Marty Wolf, go to MartyWolfBusinessSolutions.com. That's MartyWolfBusinessSolutions.com. To learn more about Kelly Hoey, go to her website, which is jkellyhoey.co. That's jkellyhoey.co. And of course, you can find Kelly and Marty on LinkedIn and Twitter. A reminder, you can find all our Business Builders shows on iTunes, Spotify, and on your favorite podcast app.
Bringing the business classroom to you. It's the Business Builders Show with Marty Wolf.